So we were talking about Grover Cleveland being married to the youngest first lady ever, 19. Can you imagine today anybody near 19 being accepted as first lady?
That's what shocked me about this. We're supposed to be an advanced society, and I just still could not see that happening today. But it happened in sort of odd kind of way, you know. He was married, and his wife died during the campaign, and they had children, and he had a nanny, and so he did the obvious thing. I guess he married the nanny. So probably all that could be justified.
Yeah.
But
When you, there are two questions here. Let me take one at a time. There are all kinds of articles and books and publications since the passing of many of these presidents that have delved back into their sex lives. John Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, run the list, Lyndon Johnson. There are all kinds of articles and books over the years written about their sex lives. When Larry Flynt writes a book about their sex lives, what's the difference?
well, that's why once I knew I was going to do this book, I immediately hooked up with my friend David Eisenbach, who's a professor at Columbia University in New York, and he's a very bright guy, familiar with the subject matter, and he had produced some very serious documentaries on these same issues for the History Channel. So the research was easy for him and I to do, and we worked together magnificently. But another reason why I brought David in is I knew nobody would want to read a history book about written by a pornographer. So I was just covering myself there.
How difficult is it, to your point about nobody wanting to read a book about presidents and their sex lives written by a pornographer, how difficult is it to get the American people to wrap their brain around stuff like this that's very uncomfortable? What Lincoln did, what Kennedy did. How do you...
Well, the American people have an insatiable appetite for this. Over the last 35 years, we've outed dozens of corrupt politicians. Mainly, some of it's been financial, but most of it has been sexual misconduct. And it was never with the thought we're going to expose somebody's sex life, but only exposing the hypocrisy of it, you know, that they got 2 or 3 mistresses and a wife, and then how they going to go, what they going to vote for, they go on the floor, you know. And people, I think, now want more information. And no book has ever been written like this, because you see, the publisher of history books are conservative. They tend to only want politics and policy. They don't want to know about sex. Well, I know that there's a market out there that does want to know about the sex lives of the politicians.
That raises 2 questions, though, Larry. Why do we care? What does it matter? There may be an insatiable appetite for it. There may be money to be made from it. But what difference does it make? Why should I care what these guys did?
I tell you where the big difference is.
Okay.
Is you can look back. There's an old saying, the further you see is the further you can see behind you, you know, because you also see in front of you. Well, I think many people feel that Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and these guys, that they were nobility. You know, they would never have an indecent transgression, you know. And it's just not true, you know. They're largely just like us. They were flawed people, you know. And there's a lot to write about them, and in terms of the areas where they were flawed.
See, I've always thought, and this is always uncomfortable for me to even acknowledge, but you and I discussed this before. I regard Dr. King, as people know all the time, I say this all the time, I regard Dr. King as the greatest American we've ever produced. That's my own assessment. He's the greatest American. I can debate you on FDR, I can debate you on Lincoln, but King is my man. And as I got to be older and delved more into who King really was, and I saw the good and the bad and the ugly, and I saw the women, etc., that was hard for me initially to wrap my brain around. But as I matured more, I came to understand how that made him more human.
Yeah.
Because he's flawed like all the rest of us. We're not human and divine, we're just human. And it gave me actually more respect for King, because Hoover knew all the stuff that you and I now know and was using it against Dr. King, trying to get him to pipe down. King says, I know what you know about me, but I'm still not going to bow, I'm still not going to bend, I'm still not going to give in. So in some ways, it made me respect him even more that he was such a flawed human being.
But, you know, Dr. King had a very important conversation with some of his friends, you know, Andy Young, Abernathy, and the boys. He said, this is when it surfaced that J. Edgar Hoover had these tapes. And Martin said, look, I'm gone from home 27, 28 days a month. I'm only a man. So he said a world of words in just that one statement. And to me, I gave him a pass on everything because I understood. I realized the contribution he was making to the civil rights movement. I realized, you know, what a great, decent man he was, and then he's not allowed to be human. I had this conversation back in the 70s with Dick Gregory, you know, the activist. Sure. Dick told me, he says, they were wanting tapes to come out, and Dick said, it's not going to matter, you know, and I kind of believe he was right, because you remember when we were trying to get Dr. King's birthday a national holiday?
Oh, Lord, yes.
And who voted against it every damn time? All those Republicans, right? And John McCain was leading the pack, okay? They knew these tapes existed, and they wanted them to surface because they thought that would kill the whole idea.
Oh, King Holiday.
No King Holiday. You know, and then they still go in front of the NAACP and give their their speeches that just make me want to vomit. You know.
Yeah. Why is it? And this is a question that if anybody can answer, Larry Flynt can. Why is it with regard to presidents or any other story, we are a nation that is so obsessed with sex? Why are we one nation under sex?
I'll tell you why. Because other than the desire for survival, the strongest single desire we have is the desire for sex. And you would think, and we use it to communicate with more than any other medium in the world. So you would think, if it was that important, we'd know a little bit more about it. But people are still ignorant about it. You know? They have so many hang-ups, you know, they can't get to first base.
Yeah. What do you make of, and I can hear people watching this right now arguing it either way. It can be argued either way. What do you make of the trajectory that this country is on, with regard to sex? There's some people obviously who make the argument that we're getting to be more open, and thank God we're not as hung up as we used to be. And there are other folk who think we are sinking into the abyss because we're so over sex now. How do you read this contemporary sexual revolution, so to speak?
Well, I spent a lot of time in Europe. We do a lot of business over there. And the Europeans are much more laid back.
Always have been.
About sex.
Yeah.
Well, the French, the Italians, they all are. It's automatically assumed that every politician has a mistress, so nobody has to discuss it, you know. And if you remember at Mitterrand's funeral,
the wife sat next to the mistress.
There, and his mistress was there, and their child was there at the funeral, and there's no big deal. So, but America hasn't grown up that much yet. But as long as we intend to think of sex as being something bad, it's going to always have bad consequences.
Well, it can be bad though, Larry. When you wreck families and you deceive people and you're hypocritical and you lie, sex does have negative consequences if done with the wrong person in the wrong setting.
But see, here's the thing about it: you can't be responsible for other people's excesses. Tavis, you know. So I own a casino, you know. People try to always talk to me about the 1% of the population that are problem gamblers, so that I've got to do something for them. I said, I'm running a business. I can't be bothered with 1% of the people that have problem with their excesses. And I think, you know, the same thing applies to sex.
Here's the exit question. What is it that you want Americans most to take from reading this book, One Nation Under Sex?
First of all, it's well-researched, well-documented. Nobody's going to find a fault with its authenticity. We covered not just a couple of people that I had time to talk with you about, but also even Clinton and the Kennedys are in there, and we devoted a lot of time. And you know, I got sidetracked in my thoughts. I want to go back to something I was going to say. I grew up during that Kennedy mystique, you know.
Camelot.
Where everybody felt that it was a great time to be alive, that you could achieve what you wanted to, that your government was good, you know. And believe me, Kennedy did reinforce this to the American people at a time that they really needed it in the 1960s. But where the train ran off the tracks is, and this was because I love Kennedy as a man and a person, just like the way you feel about Dr. King. And it's very, very difficult for me to do this book. Because when you see, you know, all the starlets that he had slept with, and that seemed to be his, you know, main conquest, that didn't bother me so much as the indiscretion and the recklessness and the carelessness. Where if he would have lived, that would have all came out later on anyway. But his wife, who was admired by the whole country, was having affairs even before his death, and then again even after his death. And it was sad doing the chapter on the Kennedys. I didn't enjoy that.
The new book is called One Nation Under Six: How the Private Lives of Presidents, First Ladies, and Their Lovers Changed the Course of American History, written by Larry Flynt with David Eisenbach. Larry, good to have you on. Thanks for your time, man.
Thank you, Tavis.